Welcome to the Lens of Economics for this evening's lecture, which is hosted by the Center for Macroeconomics. My name is Ricardo Reis, and I am the A.W. Phillips Chair in Economics here at the department and the director of the center, who is very happy to be hosting this event. I am very pleased that tonight we'll be welcoming Professor Adriana Kugler to deliver the lecture entitled Monetary Policy Under the Shadow of Geopolitical Uncertainty. Adriana is a professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy and Economics at Georgetown University. And before that, she held positions also at Houston University and Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. But just as remarkable as especially her long service, I think by now, and work at Georgetown, is the fact that for quite a while she has really had many positions in public service and has taken those positions and come back to academia, back and forth, really benefiting and making the most out of that interaction. She was chief economist of the U.S. Department of Labor during the Obama administration, I believe around 2010-11, a crucial time during the global financial crisis and where the labor markets were changing very much. She then served as U.S. executive director at the World Bank, therefore interacting with some of the issues of development economics, especially labor markets. And then from September 23 to August 25, she was a governor at the Federal Reserve Board setting monetary policy in the United States. As a researcher, her interests included labor markets and policy evaluation in developing countries, and she has written some very important research work on employment protection and productivity in the US, immigration in Europe, vocational training in Colombia, employment protection in Italy. So you see she's covered really the whole world in terms of thinking about labor markets in a very productive academic career and a very influential one. And then, though, during the last couple of years, she has turned attention to the dark arts of monetary policy, and is now, as I was speaking to her earlier, already writing many, many interesting papers, likewise covering areas of the globe on monetary policy and how it works. And today she's really going to tell us how monetary policies are affected by geopolitical developments, and dive into how they ultimately impact shocks and expectations. For social media users in the audience, the hashtag for the event is hashtag LSECFM. The event is being recorded and will be made available in the LSE website immediately, soon, depending on how the tech guys, how efficient they are. But now I'm delighted to hand over to Adriana for a presentation, and then we'll have some rounds of questions afterwards. So please join me in welcoming Adriana to the stage.
Well, thank you, Ricardo, for this really generous introduction. And thank you to Silvana as well, and to everybody at CFM for the invitation to come here. I want to give you an anecdote. In fact, Ricardo had been asking me for a title and an abstract of what I was going to talk about back in February. And on February 27th, I sent this title: Monetary Policy Under the Shadow of Geopolitical Uncertainty. Obviously, the next day, we found out that the Iran conflict, or what was a conflict then that was supposed to last a few days, maybe a few weeks, and has turned into the Iran war, started. So a lot of foresight, and thank you for pushing me to give you a title early on, which turned out to be fortuitous because it's very relevant, especially given the realities we're living today. So let me start by telling you a little bit about why I was interested in looking at this topic. So as Ricardo said, I spent the past few years at the Federal Reserve Board, and I was one of those people that definitely focused squarely on domestic issues, but I also focused very much on global developments. And people would ask me this all the time, given that you just came from the World Bank, where I helped to facilitate actually budget support to Ukraine. I came into the World Bank right after the war in Ukraine. The Russian invasion of Ukraine had happened after February 2022. So all of these things were very much at the forefront of what I was thinking. And the answer is yes, I definitely thought about these issues back in the moment. And I think most central bankers have now focused not only from thinking about domestic issues, but also thinking about global developments. As you know, most central bankers focus squarely on a single mandate, which is usually price and financial stability. In the case of the US, this is a dual mandate, and this dual mandate is price stability plus maximum employment, which very much explains why they wanted a labor economist like me and the board who understood the interaction between labor markets and inflation and productivity and other factors that I also had studied in depth. So as I mentioned, when central bankers are looking and focusing on these mandates and fulfilling these mandates, they usually focus on domestic issues to understand what direction the economy is taking. What are the potential weaknesses and strengths that economies are facing? Yet, as I mentioned, during the past decades, these global issues, and in particular geopolitical risks, have come to the forefront. They have become much more prevalent and ubiquitous. So given that, central bankers have been forced to actually think about these geopolitical risks and geopolitical shocks. For example, just to give you an example, Christine Lagarde and also Jay Powell in 2022 both mentioned, right, after their meetings, after their rate meetings, that at the time, the Russian invasion of Ukraine was going to have important effects on decision-making moving forward. And some more faster, some slower, but they certainly had it in their mind at the time. When Rishi Sunak was the Chancellor of the Exchange, the Exchequer, he also mentioned these geopolitical risks, in particular the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in terms of the effects that this would have on the budgets in the UK. And more recently, obviously, Andrew Bailey and the entire Bank of England committee has decided to stay put, citing in this case the Iran war and the potential inflationary effects that the Iran war is particularly having on food and energy prices. So this is now at the forefront of most policymakers in central banks, but also obviously on the fiscal side, policymakers are also paying a whole lot of attention to geopolitical risks. Now, during this past decade, these geopolitical risks are associated with greater and greater uncertainty. So it's not only that these geopolitical risks are more prevalent, but they have also been associated with greater uncertainty. And I'm going to show you some data that shows a little bit of this development in recent years. Indeed, some of the words that get used most often by businesses, by households to describe the current environment are uncertain, unpredictable, ambiguous, volatile, right? All words that we economists definitely associate with greater uncertainty. So what are the sources of this uncertainty? Obviously, this geopolitical uncertainty can come from global factors, but it can also come from domestic policy that relates to countries outside of the domestic realm. Globally driven uncertainty is driven by international conflicts and wars, by pandemics, and domestic policy-driven geopolitical shocks can be driven by things such as national security policies, trade policies, but also sometimes domestic policies involving sovereign debt and other factors that tend to have effects on other countries as well. So I'm going to actually look into these different sources of uncertainty to understand how the effects may differ in terms of economic activity. So I don't want to give you PTSD, but you know, we've all remember from starting in 2020, the many shocks that have come our way and the implications that it's had on economic activity in countries around the world. Starting with COVID, right, in 2020, beginning of 2020, many deaths, but this also had major economic implications, a slowdown in the global economy, supply chain disruptions that we had never seen before, And the supply chain disruptions eventually led in big part to some of the inflation that we saw coming on later in 21 and 22. And then we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, loss of innocent lives again. But at the same time, you also had not only loss of infrastructure in Ukraine, but you had implications, economic implications for the rest of the world, including a scarcity of oil and natural gas. And here in Europe, you felt it much more than we did in the US, but also a scarcity of fertilizer, of grains that affected food prices around the world. So I remember when I was at the World Bank, African countries, Asian countries, countries in the Middle East, suffering from spiking food prices and especially price of grains. So these had important implications, which also contributed to some of the inflation that took off starting in 2021. Then you had the October 7th attack in Israel, and you had again the loss of thousands of innocent lives. You had the capture of hostages, which eventually led also to a war in Gaza, and an expansion of that Middle East conflict at the time, which lasted at least until 2025. Certainly with a lot of concern, and I remember at the time, a lot of concern about this spreading to the Strait of Hormuz. Believe me, what happened in the Strait of Hormuz and what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz was no surprise to any of us. We were all thinking about it, even back then, thinking that the broadening of the conflict in the Middle East could certainly have implications for gas prices at the time. And then come 25, 26, we've had many other geopolitical shocks. So the trade war, which started early in 2025, again, an increase in tariffs on China and an escalation of those tariffs, retaliation back and forth, which escalated those tariffs to up to 140%. Also tariffs on the nearest allies for the US, so Canada and Mexico, going up to 35%. They're now 25% with some exceptions from USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada free trade agreement. Then came Retaliation Day. I remember I was actually at Princeton at the time, giving a talk, exactly at 4 o'clock, the time when the president was going to make the announcement about what tariffs were going to apply to whom. And we found out that there were tariffs applied to about 200 countries, close to 200 countries, tariffs that range between 10% for countries such as England, the lucky ones that get the lower end of the range, and then up to 50, 60% for countries such as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which were engaging in diversion of Chinese goods coming to the US. So many implications. Here's a picture of all the containers that were held in the port of LA and Long Beach, but also in the ports of Shanghai and Guangdong. So again, supply chain disruptions happening again, where these containers were being held in ports around the world, waiting to see what was going to happen to the tariffs. And of course, that took many, many months to actually be resolved. And then you had the confrontation with Venezuela at the end of 2025. The confrontation of Venezuela was of a different nature, but it also involved oil and the seizure of oil tankers off the coast of Venezuela in the Caribbean. It involved the shutdown of many boats also in the Caribbean that were thought to be carrying drugs, and eventually ended with the capture of Maduro in January 3rd of 2026. And of course here in Europe, you all remember the Greenland diplomatic crisis that came in early January again, 2026. And you may wonder, well, what does this have to do with economics? It did have to do a lot with economics. We just found out that Greenland has substantial amounts of critical minerals. And at the time, the request was that England should be annexed to the US and that European countries, if failing to cooperate, would face tariffs of an additional 25%. So there were economic implications also of this Greenland diplomatic crisis. And then, fast forward, you get the Iran war on February 28th of 2026 of this year. And initially it was meant to be a short-term conflict that had to be resolved quickly. But as you know, there have been many attacks again on tankers, oil tankers and container ships that contain all sorts of goods going to the rest of the world. About 20% of all oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, and the Strait of Hormuz now faces a blockade both from Iran and the US. So that has had enormous implications for prices, and in particular oil prices, but more generalized other prices as well. So given all of this, right, that's why I think we're interested in finding out what are really the impacts of this geopolitical uncertainty on macroeconomic activity. In particular, what are the effects on growth and what are the effects on inflation? Well, in recent years, the economics literature has focused on these topics. In fact, the economics literature started looking at these back in 2010, looking at the impacts on growth and unemployment, shows a pretty unambiguous negative impact. But on the other hand, the impacts on inflation and the studies of uncertainty on inflation are much more scarce and much more recent, and also show very mixed evidence. So I wanted to take a look again, re-examine the impact of uncertainty of inflation given these recent developments, in particular because these studies that I mentioned here basically end in 22-23. They don't look at these more recent developments, which show the bigger spikes in terms of inflation. So I wanted to re-examine, see if the effects are different. I also wanted to see if the source of geopolitical uncertainty has differential effects on inflation and also on economic activity. And I wanted to see if it is true that the magnitude of these effects is different this time around. So there have been some arguments that we shouldn't be as concerned because the effects are smaller now, and I wanted to actually look at this in the data. So the way I will proceed is I'm going to talk about the potential effects on previous literature. I'm going to talk about the data, the time series data that I construct. I'll talk about my main findings. I'll talk a little bit about channels, what channels we think are at work, and then I'm going to talk about implications for monetary policy. So in terms of effects, there are two effects. There are effects on the demand side, and there are effects on the supply side. So in terms of effects on the demand side, they can go through three different channels. The first channel is an option value channel. Basically, whenever there is uncertainty, businesses and mainly businesses will postpone or delay irreversible investments. And these investments could be capital investments or the creation of vacancies. That means that there is going to be less consumption, and that can definitely generate lower inflation and also lower growth. So that's the option value channel. It's a demand shock. The second channel that could be at work is the precautionary savings channel. In this case, there is going to be less consumption if there is uncertainty. So both households and businesses will save for a rainy day, and they will increase their precautionary savings. That will reduce consumption, but also investments for businesses, and this will lower inflation and lower growth as well. The last channel is a risk premium channel. So basically, in this case, financial institutions will want to charge a higher return for loans, and these will lower investment and consumption, and in turn that will lower inflation and growth. So all three of them are demand side shocks, but working through very different channels. But there can also be supply side effects, and these supply side effects are the ones that we hear the most about. There is going to be an increase in shipping costs and disruptions, and we've heard about those, right? These retention of containers in the ports, these bombing of container ships and tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, all these things definitely will create disruptions and will increase shipping costs, and that increases import prices, which generates higher inflation and lower growth. So it's a supply side shock. At the same time, strategic pricing can happen, and strategic pricing can happen if there's an upward pricing bias. So if businesses see these disruptions coming, they may anticipate by charging higher markups, and then that can generate higher inflation and lower growth as well. So it will be interesting to see which one of these different effects plays in more, and whether all uncertainty is the same. That's what I want to differentiate with respect to the current literature. But let me talk about the current literature and what we know so far. So far, we know that there is an ambiguous negative effect of uncertainty on real activity. The original paper of this by Nick Blum looks at uncertainty, and he basically finds that uncertainty reduces investment through this option value channel. Basically, there are these delays in terms of capital investments, which causes a temporary economic downturn, but also a fast recovery because it's just a delay. You're just delaying that investment, and then it re-ups very quickly. Another paper looking at this issue is the paper by Fernandez Villaverde, which looks at the effects of interest rate volatility, and it finds that it causes recessions. Born and Pfeiffer look at the effect instead of policy uncertainty, and they find that this has a negative but minor effect on real activity. And Basu and Bondic also find a negative effect of uncertainty on economic activity, which acts basically through countercyclical markups. So overall, the effect is unambiguous in the case of real activity. When you look at the evidence on inflation, the evidence is very mixed. There is basically an equal number of papers finding negative effects and positive effects, and even some papers finding no effects. So in terms of negative effects, there is a very nice paper by Leduc and Liu that looks at consumer uncertainty, and they find that consumer uncertainty works again as a value option channel, reducing vacancies. This decreases consumption, decreases inflation, and increases unemployment. So that's one paper looking finding negative impacts on inflation. A paper by Alessandri and Montaz finds negative effects, but only during financial crisis. Instead, they find positive effects during normal times. And Hack and Magnuson finds no effects basically up until the mid-1990s in the US, but positive effects after the mid-1990s. Huari finds that uncertainty shocks instead have deflationary effects unambiguously. So unlike Alessandria Montaz and Hack and Magnuson, who find kind of positive or negative effects or no effects depending on the time period or depending on the conditions. Instead, Meinen and Roerhek find no effects. And then you have the more recent papers, which actually find positive impacts. So Fasani and Rossi find that uncertainty shocks increase inflation, and they also look like a negative supply shock in the sense that they reduce economic activity and increase unemployment. Castelnuovo very nice paper by someone at Pompeu Fabra, finds that macro uncertainty has larger positive inflation and larger negative real activity effects when inflation is already high. So it depends on the initial conditions. The paper by Caldera et al. Looks at some of the same global geopolitical risks that I look at, and they find that these geopolitical risks foreshadow inflation. And Beckman and Shudash actually looks at a measure of uncertainty from the Economist Intelligence Unit, which uses news reports from around the globe, and they find a positive effect on inflation, but they find that these effects can be mitigated depending on the level of monetary control that central banks have. So very different effects, which kind of is why I think it is important to reconsider and re-examine this issue, and also to see if maybe some of these differences may have to do with the sources of the shock. So what I do is I take data for the US, I construct a time series data. I look at CPI data, so Consumer Price Index, and import prices from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I take data on GDP from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, unemployment data from the CPS, so Current Population Survey, and this non-cyclical rate of unemployment, or NIRU, from the Congressional Budget Office. So the reason I want both of these is to construct an unemployment gap, to kind of be able to estimate a Phillips curve of sorts. Then I look at consumer sentiment data from the University of Michigan survey, which, as you know, it's at an all-time low right now, and business sentiment data, an index that comes from the OECD. And finally, but most importantly, I take these measures of economic policy uncertainty, or the EPU, Economic Policy Uncertainty Indices, and the Global Geopolitical Indices, or GPR indices, which come from Jacobello and co-authors. Jacobello was a student here at the LSE, so you have to be very proud. He's now at the Federal Reserve Board. And he, together with a number of collaborators, have constructed these indices using natural language processing models and looking at news reports from not just a few sources of news in the way that Nick Blum did, but from many, many other sources that allows us to follow the level of uncertainty. When these news reports mention uncertainty, when they mention either an action or a threat in terms of a war, that's for the global geopolitical risks. And when they, in the case of economic policy uncertainty, they separate the source of the policy. So whether it's national security, whether it's trade, whether it's fiscal, whether it's sovereign debt, and whether it's regulations. And so you can distinguish and look at the impacts on inflation and on growth depending on the source of the shock. So I mentioned before, right, that these geopolitical shocks have been associated recently with more and more uncertainty. And this shows you that, right? There is definitely a trend. This starts in January 1948, goes up until the present, and you see that this economic policy uncertainty index has been trending up. It's been going up. So you see some normal periods when you think these would show up, right? So just to give you an example, this is the oil embargo from the Arab countries in 1973. This shows Operation Desert Storm in the early 90s. In the early 2000s, you have September 11th, and you have the Iran-Iraq War. In 2010, you see definitely a lot of action here around the global financial crisis and around the Great Recession. So that could come from many potential sources. It could come, for example, from increased spending and increase the Recovery Act, and just the fiscal side of things, but it could also come from the differences in regulations that came as a result of the global financial crisis in the US, so the Dodd-Frank Act that happened in the US at the time. And then in 2020, you have a big spike. You have, after the pandemic, all these new spending. Again, it could come from the fiscal side, obviously, all the disruptions that we mentioned before associated with the pandemic, supply chain disruptions. And lastly, here we have 2025-26, when you have the trade disruptions and the trade war, but you also have more recently, certainly the Iran war. So it's interesting, obviously, to try to understand what's the source of variation of this uncertainty over time. And if you look at the different components of the CPU, this economic policy uncertainty, here at the top left, you have the index associated with national security. Here in the top right, you have the index of uncertainty associated with trade. The lower left has the index associated with fiscal, and the lower right has the source associated with regulations. So very different patterns, right? Probably, if you go back, right, this kind of trend that you see here is reflected more closely in this trade policy uncertainty index, where it really is pretty flat, goes up around 2010. Actually, it's 2018, 2019, the trade war with China. And then it really spikes up in 2025 when the US imposed tariffs, which are now higher than what we had seen in the 1930s in the US. National security, on the other hand, had some big spikes early on, but definitely the highest spike comes in recent years. So here we have, again, Operation Desert Storm. You have the early 2000s, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. And then you had some action around here in 2020, around before 2020. And then definitely the Iran War showing up here together with the other conflicts that I mentioned before. In terms of fiscal, here you have less of a pattern. You have a lot of ups and downs. A lot of these are associated with military spending. So the same wars that we mentioned before show up in the fiscal uncertainty index, and that's because of the spending in the military side and defense. And then you have increases in 2010, where you have the Recovery Act following definitely the Great Recession, but you also had a shutdown happen during this time. Certainly a shutdown as well here in the 1990s. And then here in 2020, you have the CARES Act, which put trillions of dollars into the economy, and a lot of uncertainty over that, and more recently another shutdown and the so-called BBB bill, so the Big Beautiful Bill, which introduced a lot of uncertainty and a lot of back and forth in Congress over spending in the US economy. And here, in terms of regulation, you have a lot of ups and downs. Obviously, this fiscal side and this regulatory side may not be as related to some of these geopolitical risks, while these national security and this trade policy uncertainty index are related to geopolitical risks. So I'm going to control for these other measures in what I do, but in fact, I find that these two are not even significant. They're just controls. So let me show you another index that I use. I also use this geopolitical risk. So this is associated with the other side, which is risks that are coming from outside of your borders. In this case, these are risks that are associated with wars, either actual wars or threats that come from inside and outside of the US. And here you see, if you go back to the other one I showed you, this one, they look pretty different. There's still an increase in recent years, right? But this has much more ups and downs throughout the entire time period. And here what I do is I separate what is due to oil-related geopolitical risk and non-oil related geopolitical risk. So this has a much closer pattern to what I showed you before, but also a lot of variation over time. This one, on the other hand, has a very big spike here during the Vietnam War, right? Non-oil related. Other spikes that are happening, the ones that I already mentioned before, that you would expect would show up, such as the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, and the more recent ones as well. So I'm going to first look at these overall indices, this one, the EPU, that captures all different sources of uncertainty, and also this one at the top, that captures both oil and non-oil related geopolitical risk. And then I'm going to separate. And I'm going to show you that the results are actually quite different. So let me tell you about the main results. The main results basically show, if you look at these overall measures of uncertainty, the one that captures EPU that has national security, trade, also fiscal, and also regulation, and sovereign debt, it basically shows a negative impact. It's significant, it's small, but it's a negative impact. When you look at the geopolitical risk, that shows no effect. It's negative, but it's insignificant. So this leaves you wondering, right? So maybe we could just leave it at that and move on and say, you know, those few papers that found these inflationary effects of uncertainty were probably right, and it's working through a demand effect, so we'll leave it at that. But instead, I want to look at the different sources of uncertainty. So I separate the ones coming from national security, trade policy uncertainty, and again, GPR, these global geopolitical risk coming from oil and global geopolitical risk not coming from oil. And then you start seeing something very, very different. So you see that trade policy has these inflationary effects that we would expect. We also see that GPR oil has positive and inflationary effects as we would expect. And on the other hand, these uncertainty coming from national security has negative impacts, and GPR non-oil doesn't have any impacts. So then you can go back and think about these different channels that I mentioned before in terms of effects on demand and effects on supply. And basically what you can see is that trade is acting as a supply shock. GPR oil is acting as a supply shock. And instead, EPU, the uncertainty coming from national security is acting as through these demand channels that I mentioned before. So that's also controlling for these other measures that I mentioned before. This was in particular the fiscal uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, and also the uncertainty coming from sovereign debt. And those are basically insignificant. They're just controls that we put, but they turn out to be insignificant. So these effects on geopolitical risk coming from the global side, right, really seem to matter, especially national security and trade. And again, they have completely opposite effects. So this may explain why in the literature, right, you have effects on inflation all over the map. They're positive in some studies, negative in others, but they don't distinguish the sources of uncertainty. In terms of the impacts on growth, in fact, I only find that the effects of growth, negative effect, at least the contemporaneous effects on growth, only come out when you look at these global geopolitical risk coming associated with oil. So those effects are negative. And then I asked, well, what could be the channels through which this is working? So how are these uncertainty shocks affecting prices? And in fact, when you control for import prices, you see that the effect of GPR oil actually disappears. So this is this column 3 here. So that comes out very positive and significant. And in fact, in this case, GPR oil, the effect of GPR oil, which was before positive, ends up disappearing. The other way in which this may be working is through sentiment. So I told you that I collected data on both business sentiment and consumer sentiment. And I basically, what I do, I'm not going to show you the big tables because they're kind of big. I'm interacting these sentiment indices with some of the uncertainty shocks. And basically, I find that they're significant in a few cases. In fact, that increased business sentiment increases the inflationary effect of TPU, of the Trade Policy Index, probably because businesses are less willing to absorb or reap the price increases from their profits and are more likely to pass through these price increases to the consumer. So that's one explanation for why we're probably finding that. Then a decreased consumer sentiment increases the inflationary effect of import prices. This could happen, for example, if, as we know has happened in the past, workers are more likely to demand higher salaries when they have low consumer sentiment and they know that prices are going up and they may demand higher salaries, and that may exacerbate the effects, inflationary effects of import prices. And lastly, I find that decreased consumer sentiment makes larger this inflationary effect of GPR from non-oil factors. And this could happen simply because there is going to be less consumption. If consumer sentiment is very negative, people don't consume, and this disinflationary effects from uncertainty coming from non-oil factors, it actually shows these inflationary effects. So these are different channels through which uncertainty may be working. And here's some of the magnitudes of the effects. This is showing the effects of 2 standard deviation changes. These effects that I find here for import prices are actually commensurate with what other people have found in terms of the effects of tariffs over the past couple of years on inflation. And there are smaller but still significant effects of trade policy uncertainty, which comes positive in this case, even after controlling for import prices, which means that there must be spillovers on non-imported prices, right, domestic prices as well, which is what others have found, and also negative impacts of economic policy uncertainty from national security. So then, as I mentioned before, I wanted to see if in fact these effects are smaller or bigger this time around. So I do interaction models of these uncertainty indices with post-pandemic dummy, and I find that these inflationary effects of import prices have actually become bigger after 2020. So contrary to what many have been saying, that we shouldn't be so concerned this time around, because now consumers are not going to be willing to take that pass-through. In fact, I find the exact opposite impact, which is that the impacts on import prices are passed on to consumers even more after the post-pandemic period. On the other hand, I do find greater disinflationary effects from GPR after the pandemic, probably capturing some of these negative sentiment after the pandemic, and especially what we're seeing right now, but it started in 2020. And the impacts of growth, surprisingly, so this one is surprising. The impacts of GPR oil shocks on growth have become more negative after the pandemic, suggesting that maybe the demand for oil is more elastic, right? There's substitutes for other from other for energy sources other than oil, and that may mean that the negative effects on growth have become smaller this time around. So let me, after seeing this, right, the fact that some sources of uncertainty have positive inflationary effects, some have negative effects on inflation, and that the effects have become greater, at least from import prices after the pandemic, the fact that they interact with consumer sentiment. I want to discuss a little bit what the implications of these findings are for monetary policy. So you may have heard some saying that when you have fog on the road, you should just stop the car by the side of the road and wait for things to clear up. That's the way we should kind of think about monetary policy under this time of uncertainty. I think one has to wonder whether this is really fog or this smoke or dust, right? If it's smoke, I mean, the world is on fire, right? So you have, right, if it's smoke coming from a wildfire, or if it's dust coming from a tornado, you just don't stop by the side of the road. If the smoke is behind you, you speed up and you move forward, right? If the tornado is ahead of you, you turn around. So this source of the uncertainty matters. That's the point. You don't just stop and wait for things to clear up, because things may not clear up, as we have seen, right, in the recent past. We can't just wait for things to clear up. We have to take action. The source of the uncertainty matters, and it's somewhat predictable, right? I showed you, right? If you're talking about trade, that's a negative supply shock. If you're talking about these global geopolitical risks coming from non-oil factors, that's going to be mainly a negative demand shock, right? If you're talking about national security, that's mainly a negative demand shock as well. So you're not going to pull everything together and act in the same way. There's something we can try to discern to decide which way policy should go. And we should be paying attention, not just to the fact that the world is confusing and tremendously uncertain, and just sit and wait for things to clear up. We need to take action. So again, as I mentioned, right, TPU and these global policy risk related to oil are really supply shocks. If you're talking about uncertainty coming from national security and the GPR non-oil associated shocks, these are demand shocks. So actions are going to be very different in terms of what you do in terms of your monetary policy. Importantly, some of these geopolitical shocks are also likely to be one-time effects. So I showed you some evidence of some of these feedback loops that happen through sentiment. These may magnify effects. Likewise, retaliation may be playing a role, and we know that happened, both in the case of trade wars, but also in the case of Iran. Ripple effects may be happening through supply chains. I showed you some evidence that this effect of trade gets magnified once you include import prices, which means that this could be happening as spillovers to other prices that are not necessarily the price of imports. This is freezing.
That's the keyboard.
Oh no. Oh. Yeah, these froze. Sorry. So we'll go manual. Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. So again, these are not one-time shocks. And just to conclude, this was actually a last slide. Geopolitical certainly matters for monetary policy. We saw past evidence, but here I showed new evidence of how uncertainty affects both inflation and growth. But geopolitical uncertainty is not all the same. The source of that uncertainty actually matters, right? And it can have very different effects. And TPU in particular, we found has inflationary effects, not discerning effects on growth that may tell you that you should be doing something clear with regards to TPU, to uncertainty related to trade in terms of contractionary monetary policy. GPR oil has effects on both inflation and growth. It's a negative supply shock, but the effect through import prices is much larger than inflation. So you hear things maybe a little more ambiguous in terms of how you act, especially when you have a dual mandate like the US. Because you may have also effects on a slowdown in terms of economic activity, but if the timing matters, right? In this case, it could be that the effect on inflation, and this is kind of what I find is much larger and it happens much sooner. So you may also have to decide on what to do in terms of contractionary monetary policy and then follow with more expansionary monetary policy down the road. And EPUNS in this case is contractionary and has these inflationary effects. So if that's the case, you may have to make decisions on whether you want to implement expansionary monetary policy. But the point here is there can be some clarity out of these findings in terms of how the source of the uncertainty will determine what action you have to take as a central banker and as a monetary policy maker. And it's important to be proactive and to look at these issues carefully to make those decisions. So thank you.
Fantastic. As I said, we'll open it for questions. So if you have any question, I'll ask the first question while you think about it, and then I'll ask you to raise your hand. Adriana, thank you so much. I wanted to push you a little bit outside of the topic insofar as you mentioned geopolitical uncertainty. A lot of the literature that you started with was an uncertainty about productivity and uncertainty about other features of the economy. We are going through a period where there's a lot of uncertainty related to AI, and a lot of our students study it and others. That's a technological uncertainty with very important dimensions of geopolitical responses to it in terms of the uncertainty. Would that be a fourth type that you would emphasize there, or would you think about, and I ask you this, I'm sorry, just because you also
Yeah.
about labor markets, when you think about that technological uncertainty and how geopolitics will respond to it very strongly, and domestic politics, not just geo.
Yeah.
How would you think about how that uncertainty regarding AI plays into some of this discussion?
So, I mean, certainly these are still early times in terms of observing the impacts of AI on the labor market and economic activity. Presumably, AI can have productivity impacts and expand the size of the economy, right? There is much more evidence of that in the labor productivity data than there is in total factor productivity. There is a divergence between the two. So it's not so clear. This happened in the 1990s too, during the tech boom in the 1990s in the US. Um, I think, we will know more about whether this positive productivity shock is there to stay. I have been generally a productivity optimist during this time period. Starting in September 23, I was talking about this as a policymaker and thinking about these issues. And I think there's some evidence, and it's been sustained since 23. So it's been at least 3 years, right, that we have seen this growth in productivity, whether it's in the labor productivity or TFP measure. By the same token, I think we also have to think about, and in terms of monetary policy, we have to think about the impacts on our star. So then it's not so clear, right? Is this lowering or increasing our star, the neutral rate of interest? And monetary policy is somehow becoming, right, looser, then we may have to think on that side of things too, right? It could invite monetary policymakers to actually impose tighter monetary policy to have any impact. So because there is all sorts of other things going on. So in my view, it's something that definitely we have to be thinking about, but it's not as simple as some others positive supply shocks where you say, well, the economy is expanding and we don't have to worry about inflation, because I think our star is going to be affected as well.
Very good. So then let me open it to the floor, and if people can put their hands up, and I think the mics are coming. So I have, firstly, if you're in the front row, so if you come here, and then I'll go there. So please say your name and please, just because it helps the rest of the audience and the online.
Hi, Charlie Bean, LSE, formerly Bank of England and various other places. Two comments. I realise the GPR series, somebody else's series which you're employing, but the GPR oil series doesn't pass the smell test to me. I mean, I'm old enough to have been a policy economist back in the 1970s, and your series has virtually no change in the level of uncertainty back in the 70s. Whereas, to me,
There was through the
well,
70s and 80s.
you know, I mean, it's
It's
like
just not of the
now.
same magnitude as now, yeah.
I mean, the 70s were a seriously uncertain time in geopolitical.
I showed 73, early 80s.
Well,
definitely there was an impact, right? It was
just compared to what
not compared to now.
it's just it sort of,
Sure.
to me, it didn't really pass the smell test, which makes me wonder about the methods that are used to construct these indices over long periods of time, just because the source information that is being drawn on probably evolves. So that's just a question mark.
I think one issue, you've got to, I mean, there were spikes there for sure in 73 and late 70s, early 80s. So you do see them. They're not of the same magnitude. I suppose one thing, you're using these natural language processing models. You're using, right, written and print copies of news, and now you have many other sources of news. And that, you're right, that could be generating this upward trend.
And also, I think the way people talk about topics has changed over time as well. So those sorts of things, I think, just raise questions about applying this sort of analysis over quite long periods of time. So anyway,
you may want to reweigh, the early period.
I mean, the other thing is just the interpretation of whether you're actually picking up uncertainty effects, because uncertainty generally rises when there's also some first moment event happening, whether it's, an invasion, but something that might have a direct effect. Mm-hmm. And just the methodology here potentially confounds those two. effects. Now, it's quite difficult, obviously, to separate them out, but it's
true, but you know, the fact that we find effects or find effects here, and the fact that the effects are different for different sources of the uncertainty tells you there is something there. There may be noise, you're right. Maybe you are not estimating them as precisely. There may be trends. I can control for trends, and I do control for trends, right? So I take what you're saying. You need to be cautious, but the patterns that I find make sense, right? And I do control for trends. Yeah.
Thank you again, Andrea, for the talk. So monetary policy. Silvana Tanreiro, LSE. So monetary policy is an aggregate demand tool that kind of set demand shocks. And this might be why you don't pick up big effects from demand side uncertainty, because monetary policy kind of set those. And what you cannot offset, or at least not fully on real time, is import price shocks or oil shocks. And perhaps that explains the pattern that you have here. Very tiny effects from these sources of uncertainty, especially the demand-driven ones. And then the only thing that really matters at the end is oil price shocks or import price shocks.
The question was.
You go first. No,
Sure.
go. Yeah.
Hi, David Aikman, NISA, formerly Bank of England as well. I guess, well, firstly, I had the same reaction to Charlie, that I thought it just didn't quite pass the sniff test to me as well, this kind of upward shift in policy uncertainty through time, but maybe we can discuss that afterwards. I think my contention is, it feels to me it's more about skewness than uncertainty in my mind. We're more likely to get big asymmetric price shocks in future than we have been in the past. We shouldn't think about it as like a normal distribution of shocks, and it's more about how should policy react when we get these kind of big upward ratchets in the price level. I'm not sure I actually think this, but I think one question would be, do you need to be running a kind of a more below the inflation target in normal times, so that kind of on average over long periods, you are hitting something more like 2%. So I'd be interested in your views on that.
Brunello for the last question. It's round of three.
Yeah, it's more or less on the same vein. So I think, especially more or less as Charlie was saying, over a long period of times, we are actually observing various regimes, right? So I think we should differentiate between cyclical and structural. In particular, when you think about the monetary policy response, there are certain type of response that can work in a regime but may not make sense in other type of regimes. And over that long period of times, there are definitely different regimes. Think about pre-71, post-71, right? The gold anchor, but also pre-74, post-74, the petrodollar was created. So clearly, something must have, I don't know whether you want to use a time variable or, to, select a kind of a structural change in those periods, and then within that regime, go and analyze the cyclical component, if I may say.
Take these first three questions.
Yeah, no, I like that idea a lot. I think that's a very important point. So looking at structural breaks and definitely looking at differential effects during those different subperiods. On the skewness versus uncertainty, I can actually try to look at that, right? Looking at different moments of the distribution of those uncertainty measures. I do, as I said, I do control for trends, and I do look at different. I think the fact that I do find different impacts of different measures is telling you it's not just noise, right? It's not just and the trend, you can see much more in trade, and you cannot see it in some of the others. I take it that the spikes in 73, end of 70s, early 80s are smaller, but they're still very much there, right? It's capturing something, and I think it may have to do also with the structural versus cyclical factors too. Yeah, and I think Silvana, again, I do put there some demand side measures. It is surprising, right, that the fiscal, for example, doesn't show as much as one would expect. Um, but it doesn't seem to be as relevant. It could be because in some sense, you're mixing, right? It's not just like you have expansionary fiscal policy and disinflationary. It's more like it's a mixed bag, right? It's going in both directions. You have the big beautiful bill, and you have the $1 trillion spent during the CARES Act, and you have shutdown. So these fiscal measure of uncertainty can capture both contractionary and expansionary policies. So I think that that's part of the story. That is not as one would expect. That it's an inflationary effect.
Let me ask second round. Lady there in the back.
Hi, my name is Deepa Srirani. I'm a former Queen Mary University student. Okay, so my question is that with the changing world scenario, so should the central banks focus, shift their focus from inflation to and pay more attention to resilient economies and building protecting the financial stability uh, of the people.
Anyone else? Yes, here. There.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Jeremy, and I'm a student from MSc. My question is, so if we see AI changes productivity and supply chain resilience so much, should central bank treat it as disinflation force or inflation force, or both at the same time, depending on the horizon?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Parishar from the University of Warwick. So my question is, if AI adoption is structurally reshaping how firms hire and fire, independent of the interest rate, does that undermine the Fed's forecasting models for employment? And are we heading towards a world where monetary tightening could control inflation but can no longer reliably anchor unemployment?
Yeah, so that last question is interesting, right? I think if you have a more sclerotic labor market, and we have moved from a very agile labor market, there of the great resignation right after the pandemic in the US, the post-pandemic period had a very dynamic labor market. And now you have a much more sclerotic labor market with low hire, low fire type of situation, very slow dynamics. It is true. There is something certainly that expansionary monetary policy can do about the labor market, reducing unemployment. If you have low hire, your low fire, it's not clear that your unemployment rate is going to be higher anyway. But you need to use other tools as well, right, to reignite the dynamism in labor markets, which is not happening right now. So I agree with that.
Well, very good. Thank you so much. We're just a minute over time, so let me conclude it here. And thank you very much, Professor Arjuna, for joining us tonight.
Thank you.